To train for the Leadville 100 MTB, I bought a suitable program off Training Peaks and purchased the premium membership to go along with it so that I could make modifications during my training blocks. My training program was primarily based on heart rate and saddle time, mostly because I don't have power meters or even access to them. All told, it was 16 weeks of training for what was not quite a couch to 100-mile training plan. Close, but not exactly. And I need to clarify that before we go any further. Let me just say that if anything that follows sounds like bragging, it isn't. Can we just get that out of the way? But if I minimize my abilities coming into both this race and the training program that preceded it, that doesn't reflect the truth of my circumstances or help anyone watching this for advice. I just want to establish that right now because I don't want to sound like a douche nozzle. Nothing that I say is meant to be a humble brag or an outright brag, okay?
Just an average guy with exceptional hair.
What follows is just a broad analysis of my abilities before I even started and how they might have helped me along the way. But I started my training program with a good fitness base, which made a difference in what I could get out of 16 weeks of training versus a longer block of cycling training. Before starting the program, I had done the David Goggins 4x4x48 challenge that's popular online, but I had done it on a bike and had actually completed a 4x12x48 challenge. That's not 100 miles in under 12 hours, but it is something. It was a sleep-deprived 144 miles that acted as the launching off point of my cycling training after I recovered from that attempt in March. The Goggins challenge was, as I did it, 240 kilometers versus the 170 kilometers that Leadville would ask of me. They're not really the same thing from a competitive standpoint, but saddle time is saddle time. Doing the Goggins challenge gave me an opportunity to dial in nutrition while riding moderate distances and also get a good grasp on all the moving parts that go into ultra cycling events. Coming out of the GC, I knew I could handle riding a bike for extended periods and stay fed while doing so, even if I wasn't sure I would be strong enough to beat the Leadville cutoffs. And speaking of strength,
wow, nice segue.
I'm probably stronger than the average cyclist competing in ultra distance events like this for my demographic.
I think though the question that we've got to ask ourselves now, given the results for all of us, barring Hank, is, are cyclists weak?
Am I strong for a powerlifter? No, of course not. But I've trained with enough cyclists over the years that it would be an outright lie to claim I wasn't above average in a weight room compared to other cyclists of my age and ability. I mean, I weigh 165 pounds on a good day, including race day, but can rep 225 on barbell back squats and barbell bench press, and my deadlift is in the high 300s for reps. And not just that, but I'm generally athletic from a cross-training perspective. I do a lot of boxing and kickboxing, and I'm into sports and functional training. I can run a decent 5K, and my 10K times are okay, and I routinely run 10 to 20 kilometers a week as cross-training. You get a better picture of what kind of athlete I was before I even started for Leadville. And I hope that lends some perspective to my experience and what I was working with. Again, not bragging or trying to talk myself up. I'm not throwing shade at cyclists, but I know enough about them to know that I'm stronger than most when it comes to picking things up and putting things down. I just want to be honest with where I started so that someone doesn't assume they can start from zero and 16 weeks is all it takes to do Leadville. It isn't. That all being said, the Leadville course doesn't give a shit what my max squat is or how fast my 10K time is. All that matters at Leadville is cycling ability, or at least the ability to execute those skills on race day. That and the ability to hydrate and eat while riding.
I couldn't eat another thing. I'm absolutely stuffed.
So my general athleticism notwithstanding, a 16-week program was good, but hardly ideal, especially the way I did it. Mistakes were made. Post-race, I 100% know now that I needed way more climbing training and way more time at elevation. Literally any elevation at all would have been a benefit given that Leadville is 5 times higher than where I live and has way more hills. Way more. Because two things that I realized too late as I was racing were that 1, you can't fake elevation, and 2, You can't fake altitude. If I could go back in time to the program start, I would have climbed more and made more road trips to places near home that offered some semblance of altitude. And the only reason I didn't was that I loathe having more time behind a windshield than behind the handlebars when it comes to riding. It's not a great reason. I get that now. But I also have a sick dog and an energetic toddler and a partner who works more than full-time to support our family, and I have to balance all of that against riding a mountain bike. Responsibilities, duties, and obligations don't care about my training being maximized for what, honestly, would have only been a slightly faster time when everything was said and done. Like, more altitude training and more climbing wouldn't have made me so much faster that it would have shaved off 90 minutes to achieve a larger belt buckle. At most, I would have been a half hour faster and received the exact same buckle I did, and alienated my whole family in the process.
I'm that kid whose father went out
Mountain biking.
and he never came back.
So, no. Balance is a bit of an illusion, but it comes down to perception. If my son felt like I wasn't home enough for him, it wouldn't matter if I wasn't or not. That's his perception, and I need to respect that. As it was, the issue never came up, so I count that as a win. I was able to get my training done and didn't make my family feel like the bike was more important than their needs. It never was, and it never will be. I was asked on social media what my training entailed. I think people in my inner circle were genuinely interested in what I was doing to give myself the best chance of success at Leadville. I also have a long coaching and training history, having worked as both a fitness coach and a personal trainer. It stands to reason that people would be interested in seeing if a coach or a trainer can coach or train themselves. And most of the time they can't. So I felt an obligation to be as transparent as possible with my training for the purposes of helping people see what I was doing and whether or not it was working. To sum it up as briefly as possible, here it is. 5 cycling workouts per week, 4 mobility workouts per week, 3 strength workouts per week, 2 running workouts per week, and 1 boxing workout per week, which equated to approximately 15 to 25 hours of training per week. It was basically a part-time job. It looked the same every week for the most part too. The only things that changed were the volume and intensity to avoid overtraining, injuries, and illnesses. A lot of my preventative care revolved around manipulating those 2 broad variables, but also required that I eat and rest according to my needs. My nutrition plan was based primarily on KICO estimates and not falling into a deficit and running the risk of red S. It's a blunt instrument, but total caloric intake for the day was often the primary goal when I sat down to eat. Nutritional density was my secondary concern, but it's only marginally less of a concern because it's important too. I don't want to be the cautionary tale that many athletes end up being when they find themselves in a caloric surplus but have nutrient deficiencies hampering their health. So I did my best to eat well, and part of that was including a diverse range of nutrient-dense foods. As an additional means of shoring up any shortfalls, I used AG1 every single day. I often used it twice per day during particularly challenging weeks. I'm not sponsored by the company, and I'm not saying everyone should immediately buy it. You have to do you, and remember that everything I'm saying is descriptive, not prescriptive. AG1 kept me feeling my best as an addendum to what was already a sound nutritional strategy. Let me put it this way. I might have been fine without the AG1 based on how I was eating, but eating poorly and using AG1 really wouldn't have worked out as well. Think of it as a coadjuvant, not a standalone solution. AG1 is one of those supplements that work better when you're already doing most things right. It's not ground up unicorn horn suspended in a magic potion that will offset every wrong decision you make in the kitchen, right? That doesn't exist anywhere, let alone in a green supplement.
Shun the non-believer. Shun.
And my supplement regimen is limited to a small number of products from various sources at the best of times. That's the only one I'm naming by brand, and probably more of an explanation than was even necessary. The ones that I do actually use outside of AG1 are almost entirely for recovery purposes and have reputations in marketing for precisely that, as in no pre-workout supplements at all. I hate that crap. Intra-workout and post-workout make up the bulk of what I use and why. Carbs for workouts, protein for post-workout, meal replacements to keep the calories above maintenance when whole food isn't possible. Arguably more impactful than all of that is that I slept harder than I trained whenever possible. I know there's this trend on social media to take photos of sweaty wristwatches at some ungodly hour to show how hardcore a person is, but honestly, ignore those people and get your sleep. They're probably sick and injured all the time. They just don't take any photos of that. Illness is a very real issue, as we all know by now. I hate hand sanitizer, but I love washing my hands, so I wash my hands like I was in a daily hand washing contest, because in a lot of ways, we all are. The research is pretty detailed in that the difference between successful athletes and those that struggle is the total days of illness accumulated during training blocks. Washing one's hands is the best insurance against illness that is both low cost and easy to implement. Besides that, clean hands make a big difference when you find yourself wiping sweat and dirt out of your eyes during training. I didn't touch my face unless I washed my hands, or at least that was the goal. No scratching the ears, rubbing the eyes, picking the nose, or touching anything above the collarbones if I could help it until I washed my hands. I know it sounds paranoid, but is it really worth jeopardizing a race that happens once per year with a notoriously tricky entry process, all because of a cold or flu?
I think not!
I did nothing that put my health or wellness at risk and did whatever I could to improve outcomes in those domains. The most dangerous thing I did was ride my bike, because that's a form of acceptable risk when you're training for a bicycle race. Everything else either needs to be avoided or mitigated. That's why I did so many of the things considered best practices for athletes, even when I thought they were time wasters or even a little stupid. I gave myself over to the process and kept the negative self-talk to a minimum. I meditated, I journaled, I used a sports psychology app, I used visualization, I studied the race course meticulously. I sought out and listened to subject matter experts on both the race and mountain biking in general. And I avoided people that said things like, "Just ride, bro." What I didn't avoid were those folks who went out of their way to give first-timers to Leadville a fighting chance. For instance, the value of the Leadville 100 MTB podcast cannot be overstated. Fatty and Haughty are all about making this race doable. The race is lucky to have them, even though they operate independently and separately from the event organizers. I will go as far as to say that if you're doing this race and not listening to the podcast they put on, you're hurting your chances of completing the event at all. Consider this podcast a must-listen resource during your build-up. Also, Outside Magazine did an online series called From the Ground Up, which was also a lot of help. There was only one season when I raced, but there are two now that are worth seeking out. Watching pros race Leadville didn't help me. The pros are racing each other. The average person will be out on the course for almost twice as long as they are and run into way more problems. The rest of us are racing the race. Finding anything that speaks to the rest of us helps a lot. From the Ground Up series does exactly that. It's so good that I'm even going to apply next year if they run it again. There are also so many videos on YouTube about specific segments, the race in general, and there's lots of personalized stories in the form of vlogs or short films. Two standouts for me were the Rafa Films video about the 2019 event.
I can tell you what to do. I fire that shotgun, that'll start the race. You put your nose on that handlebars and you start pedaling. And you keep pedaling until Mary Lee tells you to quit. That'll be the finish line. Remember, the key word is Leadville. And to go and get stuff, you remember Leadville. Anything more is not necessary, anything less is not acceptable.
And well of strength from Lifetime Events.
tell them, magic is not Ken, the magic is not Marilee, the magic is Leadville. Leadville. You make that part of you, that grit, guts, and determination that kept Leadville on the map since 1865. You make that part of you. You go home, you take that grit, toughness with you. You'll have a better family, you'll have a better community.
There are probably more, but those are worth finding. I know I watch them a couple of times each. In addition to training, becoming a part-time job and getting as informed as possible, I practically became a part-time mountain bike mechanic. I performed almost daily maintenance on my bike just to keep it trail worthy. Every single ride started with a safety check and ended with a post-ride examination for wear and tear. I practiced changing tires on one of my other bikes, especially installing tubes on tubeless setups because that scenario was a distinct possibility during the race. And changing tires is one of those things people don't practice, and it often ends a race before it even gets started for a lot of cyclists. It's a small investment of time and effort for something that can be race saving. Drivetrain maintenance too. I can't overstate how important learning to clean your chain and cassette is for preventative maintenance and keeping your bike operating at peak efficiency. I said in a previous video that Leadville doesn't care about your watts, but watts still matter. Inefficiencies in the drivetrain brought about by a dirty chain, grimy cassette, and a filthy derailleur are totally avoidable and give back watts when you need them. Why sabotage yourself for the sake of some dish soap and 15 minutes of scrubbing? As tough as Leadville is, and as high as the DNF rate can be year to year, I think almost anyone can complete it if they're all about the big picture. It comes down to preparation and planning. That's an overview of my 16 weeks of training and the lifestyle choices that went into a successful sub 12-hour attempt. It all comes down to making choices for who you want to be on race day, not necessarily who you are when faced with a decision in the days leading up to it. Oh, and an unwavering faith in your ability to complete 105 miles of mountain biking in America's hardest and highest one-day race.